Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Michuta. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-on Apologetics. And we're going to talk about the principal feast of Christendom and take a deep look into their biblical and historical background with our friend Philip Campbell. Philip Campbell is the author of a series by Tan. It's the story of Sacralization. In fact, we interviewed him on The Church and the Dark Ages, which is available through Ave Maria Press. And today we're going to talk about another book of his. It's called The Feast of Christendom, History, Theology, and the Customs of Principal Feast of the Catholic Church. And there's the book right there. And without further ado, Philip Campbell, welcome back to Hands-on Apologetics.
Hi, Gary. I'm very happy to be here with you today.
Yeah, it's great to be with you as well. You know, I just noticed this, so before we begin, it says that you're an owner of an independent Catholic publishing house, but I didn't want to butcher the name. Could you tell me how it's spelled or how it's pronounced?
Yeah, Cruachan Hill Press.
Cruachan, okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Yeah, awesome.
That's the mountain in Scotland that my Scottish clan owns.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very good. So, yeah, fantastic. So this is a great book because as Catholics, we celebrate feast, year in and year out. We really don't know the deeper background behind them. How'd you get the idea to tackle the principal feast of the church?
This book was a long time in making. I think I spent longer working on this book than anything I've ever written. I think I took 6 years preparing it from beginning to end. And it started as a series of independent essays on apologetical aspects of some of our feast days, like when you would meet fundamentalist Protestants who would say, like, oh, Halloween is just the Celtic Samhain festival, or Easter is just the Ishtar cult, or stuff like that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it started with engaging with fundamentalist Protestants who were very disparaging about the traditional holidays of the Christian church. And so I'd write these essays saying, no, here's actually where Easter came from. There's no historical connection to Ishtar or Babylon or anything like that. And I would research like when the feasts were first, when you could first find them referenced in patristic literature, early customs, what the theology behind the feast was. And then after a few years, I noticed I'd had a nice little collection of these essays on Halloween, All Saints, Christmas, Easter, and I'd written other things on Epiphany, and I thought, I should just go through and fill out the whole year and pick like the major feasts. Now, obviously, any book like this, you have to be a little bit discriminating in what you're going to include. There's a great work from the 19th century that you're probably familiar with, Dom Prosper Guéranger's The Liturgical Year, where he basically covers every single feast, and it's multi-volume. I don't remember how many, 9 volumes or something. So I was kind of like, that's too much. I just want to take the principal feasts, the ones that are very, very large or they're very, very ancient, and really do a deep dive into some of these, like really look at the history, the liturgical texts, the customs. And so it's kind of a universal history of each feast. So when you look at, like, for example, Pentecost, it'll have like, here's the scriptural background of Pentecost in the Old and New Testaments. Here's the theology of it. Here's the feasts. Here's the liturgical readings from various different liturgies, from the Old Mass, from the New Mass. Here's customs about Pentecost. So it just kind of does a universal history of everything to do with the particular feast. And I think what readers might like about it is that even though there's kind of a common structure to the chapters, but not every chapter follows the exact same structure. Sometimes, like when you get a feast like Halloween, I go way off into the apologetics aspect of it. Like, okay, here's why Catholics celebrate this. Here's why it's not a Celtic death festival, whereas other feasts like Candlemas, I don't have, an apologetics section on it. So right. So the chapters are a little bit, there's enough variety to make every chapter almost like a standalone little essay. So that was the genesis of the project. I worked on it for about 6 years, and now here we have it, and I'm very, very proud of it.
Yeah, and you should be, because you pack a lot of really great information in a format that's very readable. You cover a lot of ground in just a single volume, so it's a fun book to read cover to cover, and also it's a great resource to have on your bookshelf, because you never know, like when Halloween rolls around, somebody throws out those old canards, you have your resource right there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great resource. That's what I wanted it to be, really.
Yeah. So you tackled the principal feast of the church. Is there an official list of principal feast?
Principal is kind of a subjective determination. I mean, I guess you could start by like which ones are holy days of obligation. That's pretty principal. So I guess it depends on what you mean by principal, but you rapidly run across this issue where you'll find these feasts that their importance changed over history. Like in the early church, Epiphany and Pentecost were the major holy days other than Easter, right? Mm-hmm. And Pentecost had an octave. It was comparable to Easter in how solemn and important it was. And then over time, Pentecost isn't even a holy day of obligation anymore, So it's kind of like, is that a principal feast? Well, I took it as one because historically it was for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, Or you have other ones like an interesting feast was the baptism of the Lord, which was always commemorated, but it had no standalone feast day until the 20th century, until the reforms of Pius XII. It had no, or maybe even Paul VI. I'm not sure, but it had no standalone feast day. But I included that because even though the standalone feast wasn't instituted till the 20th century, the baptism of the Lord as a liturgical commemoration was always happening, but it was always tagged on to Epiphany or tagged on to something else. Like Epiphany used to be a very catch-all sort of holiday where over time there was many different mysteries and events that were commemorated on Epiphany. Like you don't get the association of Epiphany with the Magi until the Middle Ages. Before that, it was associated with the baptism of Christ and even with his birth. And like Epiphany was the original Christmas base. To get back to the original question, is there an official list? No, there's no official list, and in determining what counts as a principal feast, there's a lot of factors you have to take into account. So it ultimately represents my own discernment on what I thought needed to be included based on the history.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that, and yeah, with your recap, I can see why there wouldn't be. When it comes to liturgical practice, I have to say, outside of those few things that have common apologetic value that people will challenge us, it's really an area that I need to learn a lot more on. So why don't we go through some of the feast, and you can give us some background on the things that we celebrate every year.
Yeah, well, I hope you don't mind. I have the book in front of me. I'm going to use it for reference so I don't misspeak, hopefully. Like okay. I said, I wrote this over 6 years, so some of this material is not something I was just working on. But I think one that I was just thinking about recently was Candlemas, because we just recently celebrated the presentation of the Lord here in early February. And I think personally, Candlemas is a beautiful feast with lots of beautiful symbolism and tradition, and I think it kind of gets short shrift these days. But it's going by many names. It's sometimes called the Feast of the Purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the Presentation of the Lord, which I think is what it's called in the current calendar. Of course, in English, just in English plain speak, over many centuries, it was called Candlemas, at least since the 9th century, because of the blessing of candles and the candlelit procession that used to be part of this feast, which has all but disappeared in modern celebrations of the rite. So Candlemas, or the Presentation of the Lord, this commemorated a few things. It commemorated Mary's ceremonial purification after giving birth to our Lord, according to the law of Moses. but it also commemorated the presentation of Jesus to the Lord, because according to the law, you had to present every firstborn was to be presented and consecrated to the Lord. So that's what that feast celebrated. And also, interestingly enough, the circumcision of Jesus was also lumped in with this feast historically, even though in the gospel there's no indication that these things happened at the same time. But if you read the Gospel of Luke, it's listed sequentially. It talks about the presentation, and then the next passage says, and then they had him circumcised. So it came in the sequence in the readings, and then therefore in the liturgy, it kind of all got lumped together. So I really like Candlemas, and the origins of the feast go back to actual pilgrimages in Jerusalem from probably the 4th century. And you're probably familiar with the diary of the pilgrim Egeria, who was a woman who went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the 4th century. And a lot of the feasts that I mentioned in this book, they're referenced in her diary. It's this real amazing resource. This woman went to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. She wrote down everything she saw as it was happening in the Church of Jerusalem in the late 400s. And at this point, early on, it was still celebrated in February, but a bit later, on Valentine's Day, actually, February 14th. Then later it got pushed back to earlier. But there was a solemn candlelit procession to the Basilica of the Resurrection. And that's the one thing that has endured through Candlemas through all the centuries, is the solemn candlelit procession. The Old English name Candlemas, which means the candle mass. So it's really cool to look back to see something, from, the 380s, and recognize these liturgical elements that we still have. One thing that's interesting is the feast was not known as Candlemas or Purification in the beginning. It was called 40th Day, because it was believed to be 40 days after the birth of the Lord. And the interesting thing is that I mentioned it was on February 14th. If you subtract 40 days from February 14th, you don't get December 25th, you get January 5th, which is the eve of Epiphany, which kind of demonstrates again that in the early church, they were often celebrating Jesus' birth on Epiphany, not on what would later become Christmas. So it eventually became universal, and gosh, there's so much here. I'll just stop. Do you have any questions, Gary?
Yeah, well, hey, actually, this is a perfect place to pause, because the music's going to come up in a couple seconds. So you timed that perfect, Philip.
All right.
Fascinating. I've heard of the Feast of Purification, but I never heard of Candlemas until recently. So that's pretty cool stuff. We're chatting with Philip Campbell about his book, The Feast of Christendom. More to come right after this.
In 1 Corinthians 13:13, St. Paul says, "So there abide faith, hope, and love, these three." According to St. Ignatius of Antioch, faith is the beginning and love is the end. And God is the two of them brought into unity. Then comes everything else that makes up a Christian. May God grant that we may attain all the virtues that make for authentic followers of His Son.
This is a Catechetical Minute from Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
The Church has no other light than Christ's. According to a favorite image of the Church Fathers, the Church is like the moon. All its light is reflected from the sun. Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 748. The Church has a single, simple message: to proclaim Jesus Christ. As long as the Church, and all her members, stay true to this mission, we will remain a bright reflection of our Savior, and give much-needed light to a world in darkness. Jesus, shine your light upon the Church, that she may reflect your love to all who seek you.
This has been a Catechetical Minute from Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Michuta on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Philip Campbell about his book, The Feast of Christendom, and we're talking about those principal feasts that all of us Catholics, we celebrate, but maybe we don't know the deeper historical roots of these feasts. And right before the break, Philip, that was a perfect time to stop for a break. We were talking about Candlemas. So why don't we, if you want to add anything more, or you want to start another feast?
Well, I was just going to ask you, Gary, what do you think is who do you think is the first character from the Bible, other than Jesus or the apostles, to be commemorated with a feast day? Or no, let's just say the first character other than Christ himself.
Okay. Could it be the Maccabean martyrs? I'm just guessing. I have no idea.
It's John the Baptist.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, all right, great.
So we have a feast for John the Baptist, and it is, everybody agrees that this is the oldest commemoration of a character from the New Testament outside Christ, even predating Mary or predating the apostles or anything like that we know of, at least, that is attested. And what's interesting is the antiquity of his feast. It's not his martyrdom, it's his birth that is the ancient feast, the nativity of John the Baptist. So the early church celebrated the birth of Christ, and then also the birth of John the Baptist on June 24th. And I think the early church attached tremendous importance to John the Baptist as a precursor of the Lord. He seemed to represent the bridge that connected the Old Testament to the New Testament, kind of tied the whole salvation history together. In the traditional Mass, he is mentioned 9 times in the ordinary of the Mass, 3 times in the Confiteor. That's where we confess our sins. In the Roman canon, all these 9 times he was mentioned. So he's extremely popular. And what's really interesting is there's all these other feasts about him as well. So you have the Feast of the Nativity of John the Baptist, which is the most famous one. But then there was also not 1 but 2 feasts dedicated to the finding of his head.
Really?
Yes, 2 different liturgical celebrations calling to mind that his head was found 3 times. And I'm going to go through the whole story. There, I have multiple pages. I have multiple pages here. It says the strange journey of John the Baptist's head. So his head was after he was decapitated. Chusa, Joanna, who was the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward, who was secretly a disciple, took his head. It was buried on the Mount of Olives. It was eventually found by some monks there. Then they had it. Then during the Arian controversy, it got lost. Then it was hidden away. Then they found it again during the Muslim period. And so all these different times they found his head. It was like, and there would be these rumors like, oh yeah, we heard that his head is buried in this monastery somewhere. And then, they dig it up. And then they institute a new feast. So there's 3 separate occasions of finding his head and 2 liturgical feasts commemorating it. Yeah, pretty interesting. But what's also cool about the Nativity of John the Baptist, I mentioned the parallel with Christmas. There was a lot of liturgical parallels. For example, Christmas is the only feast day that was given 3 masses. And even to this day, we have 3 masses for Christmas. And if you go to those different masses, there's actually different readings, you know. If you go to the day mass or the midnight one or the evening, there are 3 different masses. John the Baptist also had 3 masses. And they corresponded to his mission as the precursor, the baptizer, and the martyr. So it was meant to kind of create a parallel with Christmas. It was extremely important in the Middle Ages. It was probably the most popular summer feast. They had huge bonfires to celebrate this called St. John's fires. And an excellent example of how important this feast was in the year 841. There was a civil war going on between the descendants of Charlemagne against Lothair and Charles the Bald, and these 2 armies came face to face on June 23rd, and they were about to fight, but it was the Nativity of John the Baptist, and so the 2 sides agreed that they weren't going to fight on the saint's birthday, that they were going to forego the fighting until the feast had passed. So the 2 armies just sat there and rested and rejoiced and had their bonfires, and then they commenced to slaughter each other on the 25th. When the festival was safely over and they could war without offending the saint.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
Yeah, really cool stuff there. And if you are a fan of Shakespeare, you will know that A Midsummer Night's Dream takes place on the feast, the eve of John the Baptist, in the middle of the summer. So St. John the Baptist's Eve is often called Midsummer's Eve because it's like right in the middle of the summer, and it was believed to be a in folk tale, it was like a night when lots of magical things could happen. So that's why Shakespeare chose to place his story of transformation and fairies and stuff on St. John's Eve. So such was the love and the fervor with which Christians of earlier generations lavished upon St. John the Baptist, who was definitely the first saint to get such a commemoration in the church.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but usually feasts are when the saint dies or is martyred. And so that would correspond to John the Baptist being sanctified in the womb, right? So it'd celebrate on his birthday.
Yes, the church attached tremendous importance to him being born, not just being martyred. And I talked about that in that book. In the womb. But there also was a feast, I'm trying to find it in the book, I'm probably not going to be able to find it, but there was a feast about his death. It was called the Decollation of St. John the Baptist, which just is a fancy way to say the beheading. So you had a feast for his birth, then you had a feast for his beheading, then there was multiple feasts for the finding of his head. So everything this guy did, he got a feast.
Yeah. Boy, that's interesting how he looms large in liturgical celebration. That, and also, like you said, is mentioned during Mass and other things as well.
Yeah, tremendously important. But I do have in the book, I have 2 feasts. Maybe I should just say what feasts are in the book so people know.
Okay.
So we got Epiphany, Baptism of the Lord, Candlemas, Annunciation, Easter, Pentecost, Nativity of John the Baptist, the Assumption, Michaelmas, All Saints and All Souls, Christmas, and then there's a conclusion on the concept of holy time and holy space. I tacked on the Annunciation and the Assumption are the 2 major Marian feasts of the Church's history. Obviously, the Immaculate Conception. Even though as a doctrine it was believed for many, many centuries, it was not instituted as a feast until 1854 or 1854? Around then, time of Pius IX. So I tackle the Annunciation and the Assumption as the major Marian feasts of the Church's history. And reading the Assumption was fascinating, studying the Fathers on the Assumption. Because in the beginning, I mentioned in our intro that sometimes the focus of a feast would change over the centuries. In the beginning, the focus of the Assumption, it was called her dormition or her falling asleep. the emphasis was on Mary passing from this earthly life. And most of the church fathers assumed that she died, although that later became debated. But then into the Middle Ages, the focus stopped being on her falling asleep and more on her glorification. That is, that her body did not undergo corruption, that it's still in a glorified state in heaven and never decomposed because she wasn't subject to sin. And as we move into the Middle Ages, you get like a transition to a focus on the Assumptio, the taking up of Mary's body into heaven. So it was really cool to read this because you can see a constant line of reverence for this mystery going all the way back to the beginning. I mean, all the way back to, the time of Constantine or before, but just how the emphasis kind of changed over time from her death to her glorification. So that was really interesting for me to read. I probably knew the least about the history of this feast before I wrote the book. And thankfully there was a lot of information out there about it to draw on.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I think it's one of those feasts that it just kind of appears in the historical writings, and like everybody is celebrating it all at once. So we're not really sure when it starts. Just it's kind of lost in antiquity.
Yeah, I mean, you can find it being celebrated around the year 500 in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was where it all started because this was allegedly where where Mary had passed from this world. So, but it was celebrated all over. It was celebrated in August there. In Egypt, it was in January. In other places, it was in other times. But it got fixed on the 15th pretty early, and I think like the year 600, it got fixed around the 15th. So pretty early on. I mean, there's many other liturgical feast days that weren't fixed till later than that. So,
yeah, interesting. Yeah, good stuff. Yeah. So as a doctrine, it's fairly recent as far as a dogma, I should say. But as far as a feast, it goes way, way back.
Yeah, and if you read, and I talk about this in the chapter, we shouldn't get confused by, I mean, the dogma was proclaimed in 1950 by Pius XII, but that's not the origin of the belief, obviously, or the liturgical commemoration. And if you read Pius XII's encyclical, when he proclaims this feast, one of the supporting pieces of evidence he gives for establishing it is he says, if you look all the way back through antiquity, you can see this feast has been observed. And then he also talks about all the places named after it, like all the churches and place names that have been dedicated to the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And he says there's a clear line going back to antiquity that this was a belief that Christians have always had.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, absolutely. So he appeals to the universal practice of the church.
Yes.
And another perfect pause right there, because we're chatting with Philip Campbell. The book is The Feast of Christendom, and we're talking about deep history behind all the different feasts of the church. More to come right after the break. Stay tuned.
If you shop on Amazon.com, there's an easy way to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Just visit smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center under the desired charity. Now, when you log into your Amazon account and purchase products, a portion of it will automatically go to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio at no cost to you. Thanks in advance for supporting CRC and VMPR. And may God richly bless you and your family.
Logan, what has Virgin Most Powerful Radio done for you?
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, I gotta say, I've been a listener for about a year now, and it's really helped me grow closer to my faith and the fact that I'm listening and I'm getting unsugar-coated, clear, charity with clarity Catholicism. And it has really helped me even, grow so much deeper in my faith as a young man and discern the priesthood and have a love for Jesus Christ. And this is so seen on the Terry and Jesse show on Virgin Most Powerful, the unsugar-coated, clear truth of our Catholic faith that is so lacking today. It's almost like the Terry and Jesse show It's the orange juice Catholicism. It's filling things up. I just need to give my shout out, my praise. I'm just so appreciative. It just really helps me, and I know people want to hear this. It inspires me to want to speak it, and it inspires me to even go as far as discerning the priesthood to think I should speak this. We need to stand up for our beautiful faith. This is the unsugar-coated beauty, and this is just what I've seen on the Terry and Jesse show. I encourage listeners to start donating and support this cause. It has just really impacted my life, and I just want to give it some praise to it.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Michuta. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-on Apologetics. We're chatting with Phil Campbell about the Feast of Christendom, which happens to be the title of his book. And this is an awesome book to have. So check it out. We'll talk about where you can get this book at the end of the program. But we're going through some of the feast covered in the book. Very fascinating stuff, I have to say, especially John the Baptist. Didn't realize.
Yeah, I really indulged my nerd rabbit hole following tendencies in this book. If I found something interesting, I just followed it all the way down. But as we get to the end of the hour here, I wanted to mention something not about any particular feast, but about the concept of holy time itself and about the very concept of liturgical feasts, because this was kind of like a big, broader principle to help me contextualize why the church has these feasts to begin with. And I think we are very familiar and comfortable with the idea of a sacred space as Catholics, right? We go into a church and we cross that threshold and we understand that we're entering into a different kind of place, right? It has its own decorum. It has its own rules. We take our hats off. We dip our fingers in the holy water. If we're celebrating the liturgy, we're expected to present ourselves and carry ourselves a certain way. We understand that in the liturgy, there's a meeting of heaven and earth, right? We've entered sacred space. And it's easy to see because with space, you could just draw a boundary around it and say, there's the church or there's the shrine, sacred space. But of course, space is only one factor of our temporal existence. We also have time, right? we have time. So God has a way of sanctifying space, setting aside space for us, saying this is sacred space, but he also has a way of sanctifying time, right? And so we have sacred times, sacred seasons that just like when we walk into a church, we understand we're crossing into a different type of reality with its own decorum. Sacred time has its own sort of reality and decorum too, right? So traditionally, Gary, what's something that Catholics are, how do we typically observe a holy day of obligation or a Sunday?
Yeah, well, just typically we just go to Mass, depending on what it is, yeah.
Or let me ask you this, what do we not do, or what are we not supposed to do?
Okay, what are we not supposed to do for...
what are we not supposed to do on Sundays?
Oh, not work, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So if you think about that, you have this decorum that you observe when you're in the church. This kind of gets to that aspect of why we don't work on Sundays, because when we enter into holy time, whether it's every week, the seventh day, or whether it's a special feast day like Christmas or something, it's acknowledging just as much as when I pass into the church through the doors of the church, the way I act on the outside I don't bring that in here. We have a different way of being in here. It's the same way when I move into sacred time, this is a different way of being. So I put off all the things that kind of characterize my secular existence, the biggest one being servile work, So one of the things we do to honor that day is we don't work. And then we devote the day to contemplating holy things or the mysteries of whatever that feast is about. And a lot of these feast days have also special things associated with them. And gosh, I hope that Catholics reconnect with some of this stuff. Like I was thinking I should do like a holy day, like recipe book or something. I'm sure it's been done, but many of these feast days, like on Michaelmas, on the Feast of St. Michael, it was always accustomed to cook a goose, So goose was associated with Michael's Day, and or there was certain meals that were associated with certain days, and there were ways of setting aside. You think about that, like in my family, we only cook a ham like on Christmas. It's pretty much it,
Right.
So when I see that big ham come out of the oven, that's like, okay, I'm in Christmas time. This is what we're doing for Christmas. So there was all these ways, these customs, these popular acts of piety, foods, abstaining from work, different acts of worship that all were meant to kind of draw a circle around sacred time, so that we could be cognizant of the fact that we're entering into these moments in the flow of history where we're calling to mind God's specific saving actions in history, and honoring them by our actions, just like we honor the presence of the Lord in the church by taking off our hats or observing the decorum of the liturgy or things like that. So I thought that was really that really helped me contextualize kind of the bigger picture behind a lot of these feasts. And that wasn't my idea. I didn't come up with that stuff. I drew a lot of this from reading the works of Joseph Pieper, the Thomist philosopher of the mid-20th century. He had an entire book on sacred time and space that was very helpful. So it's all these good ideas, concepts that people have come up with to kind of help us, like I said, contextualize these feasts in a bigger picture. So it's not just like, oh, it's Christmas again. Oh, Easter. We kind of get a bigger picture of in salvation history. Why do we do these things? Why do we have sacred feasts? Why do we have sacred space? So it's a really good meditation, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would say it's probably something that we should be emphasizing and trying to restore. Because in my research, John Calvin was a big mover for desacralizing time and space.
Yeah.
And what happened was he removed the sacredness of time and space, with the liturgical year and with the sanctuary. And what happened seems to be that the secular world kind of fills it. So now we have secular holidays that are more prominent than religious holidays. So they're secular times. There isn't a secular space, though. I mean, everything is equally profane, in the world. But as Catholics, though, we need to restore that.
That was a big move of the Protestant reformers, and you'll still today this concept that since the coming of Christ, there is no sacred times and is no sacred spaces, that basically he sacralized everything, right? And I actually addressed that argument in the end of the book, because what the Catholic Church would say is, no matter what Christ redeemed, no matter how holy and pious I am, at the end of the day, I still have to eat food, and I still have to make money. I still have to change my clothes and use the restroom. There's still very earthbound things I have to do. And those earthbound things have a fundamentally different orientation than when I'm, receiving the Blessed Sacrament or praying in the church or something like that. And so the church sees it fit to set aside times to make sure that we can put aside all those merely earthbound things, those merely earthbound responsibilities, and focus exclusively on our eternal salvation. And I think that's very, very wise. But you are right, there is a move to desacralize everything. And you see that in the idea of like, well, the church building should look just like like any secular meeting space or whatever, or, I mean, I see it in, this is just my opinion, but like there's a common theme in the United States of taking some of these feast days and just moving them to Sunday, just kind of like, well, it falls on a Friday, we'll just move it to Sunday, and it kind of, I don't know, I think it kind of robs us of the ability to let the divine just roar into our week, just be like, boom, epiphany, right there on Tuesday, right in the middle of your work week. I need the divine to erupt into my life more. I don't just want to box him in on Sunday,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I want to take the last few minutes of our interview because both you and I work for Homeschool Connections. We're both teachers, and I know from my students, I'm always hearing great stories about your classes. They love you, and they get so much out of history. So how long have you been with Homeschool Connections?
This is, let me think, this is my 13th year with them.
Wow, great.
How long have you been with them?
I don't know. I think it's about 6 years, 7 years. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we met at a staff thing one time, I remember.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar with Homeschool Connections, it's online education where you can get experts in the field to supplement your homeschool studies, and so there's a wide variety of programs and so on. So what kind of classes are you teaching this year?
This year I'm teaching modern European history and some geography, and I'm teaching the history of Australia. Don't ask how that happened, but and then next year I'm doing some early American history. I'm doing a course on the history of Japan. I'm just all over the map with the history courses, but aside from the live ones, I have somewhere around 24, 25 classes in the recorded bank that people can access through unlimited access, which is where you can get all the hundreds and hundreds of pre-recorded homeschool classes. You have a bunch of apologetics classes in there too. Yeah. But yeah, that's a great resource for parents.
Yeah, and a wide variety of things too. Okay, so you have to tell me, so where did you come up with the idea of the history of Australia?
Homeschool Connections said, "Hey, there's a lot of homeschoolers in Australia. Let's just do that." And I was like, "Sure," because I sometimes you get burned out just teaching like European and American and medieval. I was like, I'll do something off the wall. I'm gonna pick this continent that nobody in America seems to care about very much, and I'm gonna learn all about it, and I'm gonna share my knowledge. And it's been a great class. I've learned so much.
Yeah, I wouldn't even have a clue to know where to start with Australia. So that sounds like a lot of fun.
It's great.
Are you working on any more manuscripts for books or any books about to be published?
Yeah, I've got a lot of great stuff coming out. I just had one on the Church in the Dark Ages, as you know, but I'm working on a historical fiction, 2 historical fiction books for TAN about the life of St. Padre Pio, and another one on the life of St. Genevieve. They're all historical fiction. They're meant for middle school age readers. They're really cool, really exciting. I'm really excited to see those coming out. And from ARCS Publishing, I have a book on the history of the Philippines coming out in April, which is another very important place. It's the only Catholic country in East Asia, and there's so many Filipino Catholics. So it's going to be a good resource, and I think all Catholics should be aware of the history of the Philippines.
Yeah, absolutely. Any plans to have that translated into, is it Tagalog that they speak?
Tagalog is just one of many languages, but I don't.
Close.
English is one of the official languages in the Philippines, though. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at any rate, regarding where to get this book,
yes.
The best thing is just go on Amazon. Just get it off Amazon. That's the easiest. Just look for Feasts of Christendom, and you'll find it right there.
Awesome. Well, Philip, thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Gary. A lot of fun.
Yep. And it's Philip Campbell, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, go on Amazon. Pick it up. It's the Feast of Christendom. And also his other books, too. I really enjoyed his work on the Church in the Dark Ages as well. Man, the hour's flown. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. Thank you so much for listening, and God willing, we'll be back again tomorrow. Do this thing we call Hands on Apologetics. Bye-bye, everybody.